My name is Roderick, 67 years old, and I never thought my only son Alexander would push me to the ground at his Christmas dinner. I raised him alone for 25 years after my wife passed, working 2 jobs so he could have everything. His words still ring in my ears. This seat belongs to my father-in-law. Get out. What he never expected was how that night would change everything forever. Before I continue this painful story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to join our community of real-life stories. Life wasn't always this complicated between Alexander and me. Our story changed forever when my wife Marianne lost her battle with cancer. Alexander was just 8 years old when she passed. I still remember his confused face at the funeral, too young to fully comprehend that his mother would never come home again. That day, I made a silent promise to Marianne that I would give our son the best life possible, no matter what sacrifices I had to make. Those early years were incredibly difficult. I worked as a mechanic during the day at Johnson's auto shop, then picked up night shifts as a security guard at the local mall. Sleep became a luxury I rarely enjoyed. Most nights I would come home at midnight, check on Alexander, prepare his lunch for school the next day, then collapse into bed for a few hours before starting all over again. Despite the exhaustion, I made sure to carve out quality time with my boy. Weekends were sacred to us. Every Saturday morning, we would work on fixing up my old 1978 Ford Mustang. I taught Alexander how to change oil, replace spark plugs, and tune the engine. His little hands would get covered in grease, but he never complained. Instead, his eyes would light up with pride whenever we successfully fixed something together. Summers were for camping trips to Lake Tahoe. We couldn't afford fancy vacations, but those camping trips became our most treasured tradition. I taught Alexander how to pitch a tent, build a fire, and fish. The look on his face when he caught his first trout at 10 years old was priceless. He insisted on cooking it himself, and though it ended up burned on the outside and raw in the middle, we both declared it was the best fish we'd ever tasted. As Alexander grew into a teenager, he showed remarkable intelligence and determination. His teachers consistently praised his academic abilities, suggesting he had the potential for a great future. When he expressed interest in becoming a lawyer, I knew college expenses would be astronomical, but I was determined to make it happen. To save for his education, I sold my beloved Mustang that we'd spent years restoring together. Alexander protested, knowing how much that car meant to me, but I assured him his future was worth more than any vehicle. I picked up additional work on weekends, repairing neighbors' cars in our small garage. Every dollar went into a savings account labeled Alexander's Future. The proudest day of my life came when Alexander received his acceptance letter to Georgetown University. When he read it aloud, his voice trembling with excitement, I fought back tears of joy. All those years of sacrifice had paid off. My boy was going to get the education neither Marianne nor I ever had the opportunity to pursue. During his college years, Alexander thrived. He made the dean's list every semester and secured prestigious internships. Our phone calls grew less frequent as he built his new life, but I understood. He was becoming his own man, and I couldn't have been prouder. When he graduated with honors, I sat in the audience beaming with pride, certain Marianne was watching from somewhere, just as proud as I was. The real milestone came when Alexander landed a position at Wilson & Burke, one of the most prestigious law firms in Washington, D.C. With his starting salary, he earned more in his first year than I had ever made annually. He moved into a sleek apartment in an upscale neighborhood, and I could see him beginning to develop a taste for the finer things in life. Still, he remained grounded, calling me weekly and visiting during holidays. Everything changed when Alexander met Jessica Thompson at a charity gala hosted by his law firm. Jessica wasn't just beautiful and intelligent. Having graduated from Princeton with honors, she was the daughter of William Thompson, CEO of Thompson Real Estate Developments, one of the largest property development companies on the East Coast. Alexander was immediately smitten, and from the way he described their first meeting, I could tell this wasn't just another date. The first time Alexander mentioned Jessica, his voice had a different quality to it. There was nervousness mixed with excitement as he told me about this amazing woman he'd met. I was happy for him, truly. After all those years of dedication to his studies and career, he deserved to find someone special. Little did I know that this relationship would mark the beginning of the greatest distance that would ever come between us. Jessica Thompson came from a world entirely different from ours. The Thompsons were old money, with William Thompson at the helm of their real estate empire. From what Alexander told me, their family home was a 20,000-square-foot mansion in the most exclusive part of Potomac, Maryland. They had vacation properties in the Hamptons, Aspen, and the French Riviera. Jessica had grown up with private schools, equestrian lessons, and debutante balls. It was a lifestyle I could barely imagine. At first, the changes in Alexander were subtle. He mentioned getting a new wardrobe to fit in better at the firm. His casual jeans and t-shirts disappeared, replaced by designer suits and custom-made shirts. He changed his haircut to something more sophisticated and started wearing an expensive watch I knew he couldn't afford on his salary alone. When Alexander brought Jessica to meet me for the first time, I made my best effort. I cleaned my small apartment thoroughly, cooked Marianne's special pot roast recipe, and even bought a nice bottle of wine that cost more than I usually spent. They arrived in her BMW, and I could immediately sense Jessica's discomfort in my humble home. She was polite but distant, her eyes taking in my worn furniture and simple decor with barely concealed judgment. Throughout dinner, Alexander seemed different, almost like he was performing for Jessica. He corrected my grammar twice, something he'd never done before. When I brought up our old camping trips, he quickly changed the subject to a wine tasting event they had attended in Napa Valley. It felt like he was embarrassed by our shared past, and that cut deeper than I could express. 6 months into their relationship, Alexander called to announce their engagement. The wedding was set for just 3 months later at the Thompson estate. When I asked why the rush, there was an uncomfortable pause before he mentioned something about William's connections and the perfect venue being available. I offered to contribute what I could to the wedding costs, but Alexander brushed me off, saying William insisted on covering everything. The wedding was like nothing I had ever witnessed. 800 guests, including senators, business tycoons, and even a minor European royal. The flowers alone probably cost more than I earned in a year. I wore the only suit I owned, purchased years ago for Marianne's funeral, and since taken in twice as age and hard work, had whittled down my frame. At the rehearsal dinner, William Thompson gave a speech about welcoming Alexander into their legacy and dynasty. He spoke about Alexander as if he were an acquisition rather than a person, praising his credentials and potential. Not once did he acknowledge me or my role in raising the accomplished young man Alexander had become. During the entire wedding weekend, I spoke with my son for perhaps a total of 5 minutes. He was constantly surrounded by Jessica's family and their social circle. I sat alone at a table with distant cousins of the Thompsons who barely acknowledged my existence. When I looked across the lavish ballroom at my son laughing with his new father-in-law, I realized a gulf had opened between us that I didn't know how to bridge. 2 weeks after the honeymoon, a month-long trip through Europe and Asia, Alexander called with news. William had offered him a position as general counsel at Thompson Real Estate Developments, with a salary triple what he made at his law firm. He had accepted immediately. When I cautiously asked if he was concerned about the nepotism implications or leaving the career path he'd worked so hard for, he seemed irritated. "Dad, do you have any idea what kind of opportunity this is? William's contacts alone are worth more than 10 years climbing the ladder at any law firm. This is what success looks like." That conversation marked a turning point. Our weekly calls dwindled to monthly, then bi-monthly. Each time, Alexander was increasingly distracted, often taking other calls or checking emails while talking to me. He and Jessica moved into a penthouse apartment purchased for them by William as a wedding gift. When I suggested visiting, there was always some reason why the timing wasn't good. For his 34th birthday, I drove 3 hours to the city and surprised him at his office with a homemade cake, just like I used to bring to his elementary school. The receptionist called upstairs, and after 15 minutes of waiting, Alexander's assistant came down to inform me that he was in meetings all day. She took the cake with a sympathetic smile. Alexander sent a text that evening thanking me but adding that surprise visits aren't really workable with my schedule these days. I kept trying to maintain our connection. I sent thoughtful gifts for holidays and birthdays. I called regularly despite the increasingly brief conversations. I mailed handwritten letters, sharing memories, and telling him how proud his mother would be of the man he'd become. Occasionally, he would respond with a quick text or email, but the emotional reciprocation I hoped for never materialized. Once, I fell ill with pneumonia and was hospitalized for a week. My neighbor Barbara, who had become a good friend, called Alexander on my behalf. He sent flowers and a generic get-well card, but never visited despite the hospital being just 30 minutes from his office. When I was discharged, I found several missed calls from him, but when I tried to return them, I only reached his voicemail. Eventually, he texted that he had been swamped with an important deal, but was glad I was feeling better. As 3 years passed, Alexander became increasingly a stranger to me. From social media posts and the rare updates he provided, I pieced together that he had fully immersed himself in the Thompson family and their social world. There were photos of charity galas, ski trips, and yacht vacations. In each image, Alexander looked like a different person from the boy I had raised, polished, sophisticated, and somehow harder around the eyes. I began to wonder if I had lost my son not to distance or time, but to ambition and the allure of wealth. The modest values Marianne and I had tried to instill: respect, compassion, the understanding that character matters more than possessions, all seemed forgotten in his new life. Still, he was my only child, and I refused to give up hope that the connection we once shared might someday be renewed. By December 2024, I had settled into a quiet life of retirement. After 45 years as a mechanic, my back and hands couldn't handle the work anymore. My modest pension covered the rent for my one-bedroom apartment and the basics, though I had to be careful with expenses. I filled my days volunteering at the local Veterans Center, tending to my small balcony garden, and occasionally fishing with my old friend Thomas, who had retired from his law practice the same year. The apartment felt especially quiet during the holiday season. In previous years, Id put up a small, artificial tree and hung the ornaments Alexander had made as a child: colorful paper stars, popsicle stick frames with his school photos, and the salt dough handprint head created in first grade. This year, I couldn't summon the energy. The decorations remained in their box, tucked away in the hall closet. On December 20th, my phone rang with a number I immediately recognized despite its rarity: Alexander. I nearly dropped the phone in my haste to answer. "Dad," his voice sounded different somehow, almost tentative. "Jessica and I wanted to invite you to Christmas dinner at our new house this year." I was so surprised I couldn't speak for a moment. It had been 2 years since we'd spent a holiday together, the last being a brief, awkward lunch the day after Thanksgiving when Head had a business meeting nearby. "We're having about 30 people over," he continued, filling my silence. "William's family, some business associates, a few friends. It would be nice to have you there." Despite the impersonal nature of the invitation, 30 people meant this wasn't an intimate family gathering. I felt a surge of hope. Perhaps this was an olive branch, a chance to repair our fractured relationship. "I'd love to come," I said, trying to keep the emotion from my voice. "Thank you for thinking of me." Alexander provided the address: a newly purchased estate in Bethesda, and basic details about time and dress code: formal but festive. The call lasted less than 5 minutes, but I floated through the rest of my day on a cloud of optimism. My son wanted me at his Christmas table. After years of distance, this felt monumental. That evening, I opened the antique wooden box on my dresser where I kept my most treasured possessions. Inside was my father's pocket watch, a Hamilton timepiece from 1948 that had been passed down to me when I turned 21. I'd planned to give it to Alexander on his 21st birthday, but by then we were struggling to pay his college tuition, and I decided to wait for a more financially stable time. Somehow, the right moment never seemed to arrive. The watch was exquisitely crafted, 18-karat gold with intricate engravings and a chain that still gleamed despite its age. My father had received it from his father, who had saved for years to purchase it. It represented not just family continuity, but the value of hard work and sacrifice. As I wound it carefully, hearing the familiar tick that had comforted me since childhood, I decided this Christmas would be the perfect time to finally pass it on to Alexander. I spent hours carefully cleaning and polishing the watch, then took it to a jeweler who specialized in vintage timepieces to ensure it was in perfect working order. The servicing cost nearly a month's pension, but seeing the watch restored to its original glory made the expense worthwhile. I purchased a handcrafted wooden box lined with velvet and had the jeweler engrave a small plaque: "To Alexander. The time we share is our greatest treasure. Love, Dad." As Christmas approached, memories of past holidays filled my mind. I remembered Alexander at 5, wide-eyed with wonder as we visited the elaborate Santa display at the local mall. At 8, the first Christmas without Marianne. How he had solemnly helped me hang her favorite ornaments, his small face determined not to cry because Mom would want us to be happy at Christmas. The year he was 12, when he saved his allowance for months to buy me a fishing tackle box, wrapped so chaotically with too much tape that we both laughed until our sides hurt as I struggled to open it. The morning of December 25th dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow that made everything look like a greeting card. I dressed in my best clothes, a charcoal gray suit, I'd purchased for a friend's wedding last year, a crisp white shirt, and the silk tie Alexander had given me many Christmases ago. I polished my shoes until I could see my reflection and carefully trimmed my mustache and the remaining silver hair at my temples. The journey to Bethesda was complicated. I took the bus to the train station, then a regional train, followed by a taxi for the final stretch. The cost of transportation ate into my January budget, but this was too important to miss. As the taxi turned onto an exclusive tree-lined street, my stomach tightened with nervousness. The houses here were enormous, set back from the road behind security gates and manicured landscapes. When we pulled up to the address Alexander had provided, I double-checked the number to make sure there hadn't been a mistake. The house, or more accurately, mansion, was a sprawling Georgian-style structure with imposing columns and perfectly symmetrical wings extending from each side. Holiday lights outlined every architectural feature, and through the large windows I could see a towering Christmas tree that must have been at least 15 feet tall. The taxi driver whistled. "Someplace, huh? That'll be $65. I paid him, adding a modest tip that was generous for my budget, and stood at the gate clutching the gift-wrapped watchbox and a bottle of wine I'd splurged on. As I pressed the intercom, I took a deep breath and reminded myself that despite the intimidating surroundings, this was my son's home. I belonged here because he had invited me. But standing before that massive house, watching well-dressed guests arrive in luxury vehicles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to enter a world where I fundamentally did not belong. The massive front door swung open to reveal Jessica, looking stunning in a red cocktail dress that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. Her blonde hair was swept into an elegant updo, and diamonds glittered at her ears and throat. "Roderick," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Merry Christmas. Please, come in." I stepped into an entrance hall larger than my entire apartment. A crystal chandelier hung from a ceiling at least 20 feet high, and a curving staircase with intricate ironwork dominated one wall. The floors were marble, and holiday garlands interwoven with twinkling lights draped the banisters and doorways. "Alexander is around somewhere," Jessica said vaguely, gesturing toward the back of the house. "Probably with Daddy in the study discussing business. You know how they are." She took the wine bottle I offered with a polite thank you, immediately handing it off to a passing server without looking at the label. "The guests are gathering in the main living room. Through there." She pointed toward an archway, then excused herself as someone called her name. I stood awkwardly for a moment before making my way in the direction Shed indicated, still holding the wrapped watchbox in my hand. The living room was filled with well-dressed people holding champagne flutes and engaging in animated conversation. A string quartet played Christmas carols in one corner. Waiters circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked more like art installations than food. I recognized no one. After 15 minutes of standing alone, nursing a glass of champagne that a server had thrust into my hand, I spotted Alexander entering the room alongside a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who I recognized from photos as William Thompson. My son had his arm around William's shoulder, both men laughing at some shared joke. Alexander looked different somehow. Always handsome, he now had a polished quality that made him nearly unrecognizable as the boy who used to get covered in grease helping me in the garage. His suit was impeccably tailored, his hair perfectly styled. Even his posture seemed altered to project authority and confidence. I raised my hand in a small wave, hoping to catch his attention. When his eyes finally landed on me, there was a moment's hesitation before recognition flickered across his face. He said something to William, then made his way over to where I stood. "Dad," he said, giving me a brief, one-armed hug that felt more like a business greeting than a reunion between father and son. "Glad you could make it. How was the trip up?" "Fine, just fine," I replied, drinking in the sight of him. Despite the changes, this was still my boy. "The house is amazing, Alexander. Congratulations." "Thanks." He glanced around proudly. "William helped us find it. The market in this area is nearly impossible to break into without connections." He checked his watch, a Rolex or similar luxury brand. "Listen, I need to check on some things before dinner. Why don't you mingle? Dinner should be announced soon." Before I could respond, he was gone, swallowed up by the crowd of guests. I spent the next hour attempting to make conversation with various people, most of whom gave me polite but disinterested responses when they learned I was just Alexander's father, not a business associate or social connection. Eventually, I met Elizabeth, William's wife and Jessica's mother. Unlike her daughter, she seemed genuinely warm, asking questions about my life and listening with apparent interest to my answers. We were discussing my volunteer work at the Veterans Center when a butler appeared in the doorway and struck a small gong. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is served in the main dining room." The guests began moving through to an equally impressive dining space dominated by a table that could easily seat 40 people. Crystal glasses and fine china gleamed under another spectacular chandelier, and elaborate floral arrangements scented the air. People seemed to know their assigned places, moving confidently to specific chairs. I stood uncertainly until Elizabeth touched my arm. "You're at the middle of the table, I believe," she said kindly. "Let me show you." I followed her to a chair about halfway down the long table and set my gift on the floor beside it. I was just about to sit when Alexander appeared suddenly at my side, his expression tense. "Dad, not there," he said in a low, urgent voice. "That's William's seat." I looked down at the place setting, confused. "I'm sorry," I thought Elizabeth said. I never finished my sentence. Alexander put his hand on my shoulder and physically pushed me away from the chair. The unexpected force, combined with my precarious balance as I was mid-sit, caused me to lose my footing. I fell backward, landing hard on the polished floor, pain shooting through my hip and elbow. The room went silent. 30 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the scene. An elderly man sprawled on the floor, his son standing over him. "This seat belongs to my father-in-law. Get out," Alexander said, his voice carrying in the hushed room. The coldness in his tone was what hurt more than the fall. Then, as if realizing how it looked, he added more quietly, "You're at the other end, near the kitchen." Someone gasped. Elizabeth moved forward to help me up, but I waved her away, struggling to my feet as dignity as I could muster. My hip throbbed, and I could feel a bruise forming on my elbow, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation and heartbreak of that moment. I looked around at the faces watching me, some embarrassed, some pitying, some barely concealing smirks of amusement. Jessica was staring at her plate. William Thompson was observing the scene with a slight frown, as if I were a problem to be solved. And Alexander had already turned away, pulling out William's chair with exaggerated courtesy. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity what my son had become and what I had become in his eyes. Not a father to be respected or even loved, just an inconvenience. A reminder of humble beginnings that no longer fit his carefully constructed image. I picked up the wrapped watch from the floor. The corner of the box had been crushed in the fall, the elegant paper torn. Like our relationship, damaged in a way that might not be repairable. Silently, I placed the ruined package on the table, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me, not even my son. The grand entrance hall felt cavernous and cold as I made my way toward the front door. My hip sent sharp pains down my leg with each step, but I forced myself to walk normally, my back straight, refusing to show weakness. Behind me, I could hear the muted sounds of conversation resuming in the dining room, the awkward incident already being smoothed over with polite talk and the clinking of silverware. "Mr. Wilson," a young server approached me, concern evident in his eyes. "Are you all right? Can I call you a taxi?" "Thank you, son, but I'll manage," I replied, appreciating his kindness but needing to escape this place as quickly as possible. "At least let me get your coat, sir. It's freezing outside." I nodded gratefully, and he hurried to retrieve my worn wool overcoat from the closet. As he helped me into it, I caught a glimpse of myself in an ornate mirror hanging in the hallway. An old man with pain etched into the lines of his face, looking small and out of place amid the opulence surrounding him. "Merry Christmas, sir," the young man said quietly, holding the door open for me. "Merry Christmas to you too," I replied, slipping him the $20 bill I'd been saving for a tip at dinner. It was extravagant given my budget, but his simple humanity deserved recognition. Standing on the front steps, I pulled my coat tighter against the December chill. Snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes drifting lazily through the golden light spilling from the mansion's windows. I started walking down the long driveway, each step carrying me further from the son who no longer wanted me in his life. I had expected to feel anger. Perhaps I would, later. But in that moment, all I felt was a profound sadness, and something else, something unexpected, a sense of clarity. For years, I'd been holding on to the hope that Alexander and I would reconnect, that he'd remember the values his mother and I had tried to instill. I'd made excuses for his behavior, blamed his in-laws' influence, told myself he was just busy with his new life. The truth I could no longer avoid was that Alexander had made his choice. He had chosen wealth, status, and the approval of William Thompson over the father who had sacrificed everything for him. The realization was like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders, painful but ultimately freeing. As I reached the end of the driveway, I pulled out my old flip phone to call a taxi. As I did, it buzzed with an incoming call from a number I hadn't seen in years, but instantly recognized. Thomas Wright, my old friend and former fishing buddy, who had built a successful career as a corporate attorney before his retirement. Roderick, his gruff voice came through the line. "Merry Christmas, old friend. I'm sorry to call on the holiday, but I wanted to check if you received my message from last week about the Thompson investigation." My hand tightened around the phone. The Thompson investigation. 4 months ago, while volunteering at the Veterans Center, I'd overheard 2 former financial analysts discussing William Thompson's business practices. According to them, there were rumors that Thompson Real Estate used shell companies to launder money for several less than reputable international clients. At the time, I'd been troubled enough to mention it to Thomas, who had connections with the Securities and Exchange Commission from his days practicing corporate law. I'd forgotten about it until this moment. Or perhaps, if I was being honest with myself, I'd deliberately pushed it aside, not wanting to create problems for Alexander. "I didn't get any message, Thomas," I said, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Well, it's interesting timing. The SEC has been quietly building a case, and they've been looking for someone with inside knowledge willing to come forward. They have documentation suggesting improprieties but need more to move forward." I stood silently for a long moment, the snow falling around me, thinking about the velvet box with the heirloom watch I'd left behind, about Alexander pushing me to the ground without a second thought, about the way William Thompson had looked at me like I was something unpleasant, head found on the bottom of his shoe. "Thomas," I said finally, "I may have information that could help them." "Are you sure, Roderick? This could have serious implications, for everyone involved." Was I sure? I thought of Mary Ann, and how she'd raised our son to believe in honesty and integrity above all else. I thought of the young man Alexander had once been and the corrupt individual he was becoming under William's influence. "I'm sure," I said, my voice stronger than it had been all day. "Can you meet me tonight?" Thomas agreed, and I gave him the address of a coffee shop near the train station. Then, instead of calling a taxi, I began walking. Despite the pain in my hip and the cold seeping through my inadequate dress shoes, each step felt purposeful. For the first time in years, I was taking action instead of simply reacting to my son's increasing distance. During the half-mile walk to the main road, I organized my thoughts. 3 months after Alexander had joined Thompson Real Estate, Head called me late one night, slightly drunk and uncharacteristically talkative. Head boasted about a major deal with international investors that William had brought him into, mentioning offshore accounts and property values being manipulated to make the numbers work. At the time, I'd thought he was simply trying to impress me with complex business jargon. Now, those comments took on a more sinister meaning. There had been other hints, too. A conversation I'd overheard at Alexander's wedding between William and a business associate about the Russian properties and keeping certain documents completely separate from the main company files. A news article I'd read questioning how Thompson Real Estate had secured permits for a controversial development project when all their competitors had been denied. None of these things alone proved wrongdoing, but together, combined with the rumors I'd heard at the Veterans Center and whatever evidence the SEC already had, it might be enough to launch a full investigation. By the time I reached the main road and flagged down a passing taxi, my decision was made. This wasn't about revenge. It was about trying to save my son from becoming someone his mother would have been ashamed of, even if he ended up hating me for it. "Where to, sir?" the taxi driver asked. "Downtown, please," I replied, settling into the back seat. "I have an important meeting to get to." As the taxi pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the twinkling lights of the neighborhood where my son now lived. I sent up a silent prayer that someday he'd understand why I had to do what I was about to do. The downtown legal district was eerily quiet on Christmas night. Most of the imposing office buildings stood dark against the night sky, their usual bustle replaced by holiday emptiness. Only security lights illuminated the sleek glass facades, creating islands of brightness in the snowy darkness. Thomas Wright waited for me in the lobby of the Hammond Building, where his former law firm still occupied the top 3 floors. Even in retirement, he maintained an office there as a senior consultant. At 72, Thomas remained an impressive figure, his 6'2" frame still straight, his white hair thick and carefully styled. We had met 30 years ago when our sons played on the same Little League team. His boy had gone on to medical school and now practiced neurosurgery in Boston. "Roderick," he greeted me with a firm handshake and concerned eyes. "You look like you've had one hell of an evening." "You could say that," I replied, following him to the elevator. During the ride to the 15th floor, I gave him a brief account of what had happened at Alexander's Christmas dinner. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "That doesn't sound like the Alexander first, remember?" he said finally as we exited into the firm's reception area. "The boy who gave that beautiful eulogy at Marianne's funeral, who spoke so eloquently about the values you both taught him. He's not that boy anymore," I said quietly. Thomas unlocked his office, a spacious corner room with views of the city and the river beyond. Unlike the modern minimalist design that characterized most of the firm, Thomas had maintained an old-school aesthetic, heavy wooden furniture, walls lined with law books, and framed black-and-white photographs documenting his 50-year legal career. He gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then opened a cabinet and pulled out a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. "I think we both could use this," he said, pouring 2 fingers for each of us. "Now, tell me everything you know about William Thompson and his business dealings. Take your time." For the next 2 hours, I shared every detail I could remember, anything Alexander had mentioned about William's business practices. Conversations I'd overheard, news articles I'd read that raised questions. Thomas recorded our conversation and took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or prompting me to elaborate on specific points. "The most damning information came from Alexander himself," I explained, though he didn't realize what he was revealing. "Last spring he called me after a celebratory dinner with William. Head had too much to drink and was boasting about being trusted with handling what he called the KGRP accounts, Kazakh and Georgian real estate partnerships. He mentioned something about property valuations being adjusted multiple times for different documentation sets and funds moving through 6 different countries before being invested in American properties." Thomas whistled softly. "That's textbook money laundering, Roderick, if we can prove it." Alexander also mentioned a secured server that only he, William, and someone named Decker had access to, containing what he called the parallel books. As the night deepened, Thomas brought in a colleague who specialized in securities fraud, a sharp-eyed woman named Janet who had canceled her holiday plans to join us after a brief phone call from Thomas. She asked even more detailed questions, creating flowcharts on a whiteboard as I spoke, connecting names, companies, and transactions. Around 11:30, Thomas received a call from a contact at the SEC. After a lengthy conversation, he turned to me with a grave expression. "They want to move immediately. Your information corroborates evidence they've been gathering for months. They're particularly interested in the KGRP accounts you mentioned. Apparently, there's strong suspicion those involve money from politically exposed persons in Eastern Europe with known criminal connections." "What happens now?" I asked, suddenly feeling the weight of what I'd set in motion. "The SEC will coordinate with the FBI. Search warrants will be executed, likely within 24 hours. They'll seize the server you mentioned, financial records, communications. If the evidence is as strong as it appears, arrests would follow." Janet stepped forward. "Mr. Wilson, would you be willing to sign a sworn statement tonight? It would allow them to move more quickly." I stared at the bourbon glass in my hand, watching the amber liquid catch the light. I thought of Alexander as a child, his face serious as he promised to always tell the truth because that's what good men do, right, Dad? I thought of him just hours ago, pushing me to the ground without hesitation to please his father-in-law. Yes, I said. I'll sign whatever you need me to. The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. I gave a formal statement that Janet meticulously typed up, then signed it in the presence of a notary who was called in specially. Thomas made countless phone calls, speaking in the clipped, precise language of high-stakes legal matters. At one point, I stepped into the bathroom and caught sight of my reflection, a tired old man in a rumpled suit, with eyes full of sorrow. "I'm sorry, Alexander," I whispered to my reflection. "Someday you'll understand this was the only way I could still be your father." By 2 a.m, everything that could be done had been done. Thomas insisted on driving me home personally, despite the late hour and worsening weather. We rode in silence for most of the journey, both lost in our thoughts. As he pulled up in front of my apartment building, Thomas turned to me. "This will hit the news tomorrow, Roderick. It won't be pretty. Williams' companies, the investments, Alexander's position, all of it will be under scrutiny." "I know," I said, the finality of it settling over me like the snow covering the city. "Do you want to stay at my place tonight? You shouldn't be alone for this." I shook my head. "I need to be home. But thank you, old friend, for everything." Inside my small apartment, I moved through the familiar rooms without turning on the lights. The silence was complete, broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional sound of snow hitting the windows. I changed into pajamas and made a cup of tea. I wouldn't drink. Then I sat at my small writing desk and took out a sheet of paper. "Dear Alexander," I wrote, my hand trembling slightly. For the next hour, I poured out everything I couldn't say in person, my love for him, my disappointment in what had become, my hopes that someday he'd find his way back to the values that truly mattered. I explained why I'd gone to Thomas with the information about William, not out of revenge, but because I believed it was the only way to save Alexander from continuing down a path that would eventually destroy the good man I still believed existed within him. When the letter was finished, I sealed it in an envelope and placed it on the kitchen table beside the old family photo album. Then I turned off my phone, took a sleeping pill, and went to bed as the first faint light of dawn began to brighten the eastern sky. Whatever tomorrow would bring, I had done what I believed was right. The rest was out of my hands. The insistent buzz of my phone alarm pulled me from a dreamless sleep. The bedroom was filled with pale winter light filtering through the blinds, creating patterns on the worn carpet. For a moment, I lay still, trying to recapture the peaceful oblivion of sleep before the memories of Christmas Day came rushing back, the humiliation at Alexander's table, the hours spent with Thomas and the SEC officials, the letter I'd written in the early morning hours. I reached for my phone to silence the alarm and noticed the screen was filled with notifications. 50 missed calls, dozens of text messages, all from Alexander. The first call had come at 5:30 in the morning. The texts began shortly after, growing increasingly frantic. "Dad, call me immediately. Where are you? I need to talk to you now. Dad, this is an emergency. Pick up your phone." The most recent text, sent just 10 minutes ago, was simply, "I'm coming over." I sat up slowly, my body stiff and sore from the fall yesterday and the hours spent in Thomas' office. Before I could decide what to do, I heard an urgent knocking at my front door, so forceful it seemed the hinges might give way. "Dad, I know you're in there. Open the door." Alexander's voice was unrecognizable, raw with panic and something else. Rage? Fear? I couldn't tell. I pulled on my robe and shuffled to the door. When I opened it, I barely recognized the man standing before me. Alexander looked as though he'd aged a decade overnight. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled, his face was ashen, with dark circles under bloodshot eyes. He pushed past me into the apartment, turning to face me with trembling hands. "Did you do this?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "The FBI raided our offices at 4 this morning. William's been arrested. Our assets are frozen. There are reporters everywhere. Did you do this?" I closed the door quietly and moved to the kitchen table where I'd left the letter. "Sit down, Alexander." "I don't want to sit down. I want you to tell me if you had anything to do with this nightmare." "Sit down," I repeated, more firmly this time. To my surprise, he obeyed, collapsing into a chair as though his legs could no longer support him. I placed the letter in front of him. "Read this, please." While he read, I made coffee, moving slowly around the small kitchen that suddenly felt too confined with his frantic energy filling the space. I could hear his breathing change as he progressed through the pages, sometimes quickening with anger, sometimes catching with what sounded like a suppressed sob. When he finally looked up, his expression had transformed from rage to something more complex anguish mixed with confusion. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've destroyed everything. My career, my reputation, our future, are gone." Jessica is hysterical. Her mother has taken her to their place in Aspen. All because you were upset about a stupid dinner incident? I sat down across from him, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug to stop them from shaking. "This has nothing to do with what happened at dinner, Alexander. Though that showed me how far you've strayed from the man your mother and I raised you to be." "You had no right," he began, but I cut him off. "I had every right. Not as your father, but as a citizen who knows about criminal activity. William Thompson has been laundering money for international criminals. You know this. You've been helping him do it, whether you want to admit it or not." "It's not that simple," Alexander protested, but with less conviction. "These are complicated business structures, international finance. You've never understood how the real world works." I reached across the table and placed my weathered hand over his manicured one. He flinched but didn't pull away. "The real world is exactly what I understand, son. I've lived in it my entire life. What William Thompson created was a fantasy world where normal rules don't apply, where the wealthy and connected can ignore laws that inconvenience them." Alexander stared at our hands for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in his posture changed. His shoulders slumped, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its defensive edge. "I didn't know. Not at first." He raised his eyes to meet mine. "William brought me in to handle what he called special client relationships. Everything was compartmentalized. By the time I realized what was really happening, I was already implicated. He made it clear there was no backing out." "You always had a choice," I said gently. "You still do." "What choice? My father-in-law is being held without bail. Our family assets are frozen. My wife's left me. The partners at my old firm won't even take my calls." The panic was rising in his voice again. "What am I supposed to do now?" I got up and went to the old wooden chest in the corner of the living room, the one that held our family photographs and keepsakes. From it, I removed a small velvet box different from the one I'd taken to his house yesterday. "Open it," I said, placing it before him. Inside was a simple silver compass, tarnished with age. Alexander looked at it uncomprehendingly. "This belonged to my father, your grandfather," I explained. "He gave it to me when I was just 16 and feeling lost about my future. He told me something I never forgot. No matter how far you've gone down the wrong road, turn back. It's the only compass you need in life, the courage to admit when you're heading in the wrong direction." Alexander picked up the compass, its chain dangling between his fingers. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes, the shadow of the thoughtful boy had once been. "I'm facing criminal charges, aren't I?" he asked quietly. "Most likely," I acknowledged. "But Thomas believes you could be treated as a cooperating witness if you come forward voluntarily with everything you know." "Thomas? Thomas Wright? You've been talking to him about this?" "He's the one who helped me contact the SEC. He believes in you, Alexander. He remembers the young man who used to talk about wanting to use his law degree to help people, not exploit them." Alexander set the compass down carefully and buried his face in his hands. When his shoulders began to shake, I moved to his side of the table and did something I hadn't done in years. I put my arm around my son and held him while he cried. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of our lives. Alexander spent hours with federal prosecutors, turning over documents and explaining the intricacies of William's financial schemes. He resigned from Thompson Real Estate and surrendered his law license pending the outcome of the investigation. Jessica filed for divorce in January, unwilling to stand by a husband facing potential disgrace and financial ruin. The prenuptial agreement Alexander had signed meant he walked away with virtually nothing from the marriage. With nowhere else to go, he moved into my spare bedroom, the room that had been his throughout childhood. Those first days were awkward, the weight of all that had happened creating a barrier between us that seemed insurmountable. But slowly, day by day, we began to rebuild. We started with simple things, making meals together, watching old movies we both loved, taking walks around the neighborhood. One evening, I found him looking through the family photo albums, lingering over pictures of his mother. "She would be so disappointed in me," he said, tracing Marianne's smiling face with his finger. "No," I corrected him gently. "She would be disappointed in your choices, but never in you. And she'd be proud of what you're doing now, taking responsibility, making amends." By March, the federal investigation had progressed significantly. William's extensive network of shell companies and fraudulent transactions had been mapped out, revealing connections to several international criminal organizations. Because of Alexander's cooperation, prosecutors recommended reduced charges, carrying a maximum of 3 years, rather than the 20-plus years he might have faced. During this time, Alexander received a call from Janet Thomas' colleague, who had helped us that Christmas night. Her firm was establishing a new compliance division focused on preventing the very kinds of financial crimes Alexander had helped uncover. They wanted him as a consultant, believing his insider knowledge would be invaluable. "Do you think I should take it?" he asked me over dinner. "I know I don't deserve a second chance." "Everyone deserves a second chance," I told him. "The question is, what you do with it." He accepted the position, starting part-time while his own legal issues proceeded through the courts. The salary was modest compared to what Head earned at Thompson Real Estate, but it was honest work that used his skills for something positive. In April, Jessica contacted Alexander unexpectedly. Their meeting at a quiet coffee shop lasted hours. When he returned home, there was a peacefulness about him I'd not seen in years. "She apologized," he said, sounding surprised. "Said she'd been raised to chase status and money above all else, and never questioned it until everything fell apart. She's been seeing a therapist, trying to figure out who she is without her father's influence." "And how do you feel about that?" I asked carefully. "Grateful," he replied after a thoughtful pause. "Not because I think, well, get back together we won't, but because it helps to know I'm not the only one who lost their way." By summer, Alexander had moved into his own apartment, small but comfortable, within walking distance of my place. We still had dinner together several times a week. One evening in early July, he arrived with unexpected news. "Jessica is pregnant," he said, his expression a mixture of shock and wonder. "She just found out. It's mine from before everything happened." The implications were enormous. Despite their divorce, Alexander would be forever connected to the Thompson family through this child. But as we talked through the night, I saw in him a determination to be a different kind of parent than William had been, to create a legacy of integrity rather than wealth. When his son was born in January, a healthy boy, they named him James Roderick Wilson. Jessica suggested they raise him together, not as a reunited couple, but as committed co-parents who had both learned difficult lessons about what truly matters in life. Now, as I sit on a park bench watching Alexander push little James on the swings, I marvel at how much can change in a single year. My son is serving his community service hours teaching financial literacy at a local high school. Next month, he'll begin a 2-year sentence at a minimum security facility, a consequence he has accepted with dignity. Despite these challenges, there is a genuineness to him now that had been missing for years. When he laughs with his son, it's with the full-bodied joy I remember from his childhood, not the calculated social chucklehead developed in William's world. Last week he asked me a question that had clearly been on his mind. "Do you ever regret what you did that Christmas night? Turning in William, knowing what it would mean for me?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I regret that it caused you pain. I regret that it cost you your marriage and your freedom. But no, I don't regret the action itself. Sometimes, love means being willing to risk losing someone in order to save them from themselves." He nodded, seeming to accept this. Later that evening, he presented me with a gift, a new display case for my father's pocket watch, which now sits on my mantel where I can see it every day. Inside the case, Head placed a small card with words that heal my heart whenever I read them. "To the father who never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. Thank you for the hardest gift you've ever given me, the truth. The journey has not been easy, and it isn't over. There are still difficult days ahead, but we face them together now, with honesty between us and a shared understanding of what family truly means, not power or prestige, but the courage to hold each other accountable and the grace to begin again when we fail. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have had the courage to take action, knowing it would hurt someone you love?" Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between protecting someone and helping them face consequences? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is the one that seems the hardest in the moment.